Evening everyone, and welcome to the 23rd Kilbrandon lecture. When common sense is complicated, a call for cultural reform to safeguard children beyond their hopes will be given this evening by Professor Carlene Firmin. I'm Professor Fiona Dyer. I'm based at the Children and Young People Centre for Justice here at the university. We're based within social work and social policy and a centre funded by the government. We work across Scotland to prioritise rights, respect and justice for children and young people in conflict with the law. And it's my honour to chair this evening's lecture. It's great to see so many people here in such a dreich Scottish evening, but it's really great and you are in for a treat this evening. Carlene spoke at the National Youth Justice Conference, so I can guarantee you an excellent, thought-provoking lecture. The subject of tonight's lecture focuses on ways to protect children from harm, something that is deeply embedded throughout the Kilbrandon principles. And just yesterday, 60 years on from Kilbrandon, the decision to finally scrap the two-cap benefit shows that the fight to protect children from poverty and other harms is still very one that's alive for us today. But before I introduce Professor Carlene Firmin to you, I would like to introduce Professor Neil Quinn from the Department of Social Work and Social Policy to give you the welcome. Neil, thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. It's great to be here and great to see such a great turnout for tonight's lecture. Good evening all. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 23rd Kilbrandon lecture. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Carlene Firmin from the University of Durham. I look forward to hearing Professor Firmin's contribution to this long-established lecture series. There have been many distinguished lecturers since the lecture was inaugurated. Donald Dewar and Nicola Sturgeon, both First Ministers of Scotland. Sir Harry Burns, Scotland's former Chief Medical Officer and Professor of Global Public Health here at Strathclyde. The writer and broadcaster Frank Cottrell-Boyce, Professor Phil Scraton from Queen's University Belfast, and last year we had the pleasure of hearing from Professor Ken Norrie from this university on the topic, Who then in law is my parent? The committee, which Lord Kilbrandon established in 1960, led to the formation of Scotland's unique and globally respected approach to care and justice for young people, the Children's Hearings System. The hearing system is designed to ensure that children's needs are considered whenever legal proceedings relating to care and justice concerning children arise. Since its inception, the system has contributed immensely to the care of children and to greater respect for their rights and their futures. The lecture series have always enjoyed the strong support of Lord Kilbrandon's family, and I'm delighted that tonight they're represented by three of Lord Kilbrandon's grandchildren, Heather, Donald and Torquil. You're very welcome. The Kilbrandon Lecture Series is a joint venture with the Scottish Government and the University of Strathclyde. And now for many years it's hosted by Strathclyde's Department of Social Work and Social Policy. I'm delighted that Professor Fiona Dyer has agreed to chair the lecture and the Q&A session afterwards. We'll also hear from Alison Gordon, Chief Social Work Officer from North Lanarkshire Council, and also Ryan McShane, a campaigner and student of law at the University of Strathclyde with lived experience of care. They will both provide a brief response to tonight's lecture. Can I also extend a special welcome to Neil Hunter, Principal Reporter and Chief Executive of the Scottish Reporters Administration, who will deliver a vote of thanks after the lecture. And I'm also delighted to have in tonight's audience individuals engaged in the lives of children and young people in Scotland, panel members, social workers, healthcare workers, teachers, members of the legal profession, and very importantly, students and young people with lived experience of care. You're all very welcome. Can I also draw your attention to the display and the transept of work from Articulate Cultural Trust in collaboration with Inch Architecture and Design. Articulate Cultural Trust is a charity established in 2017 by Chief Executive Iona Craig. It supports dynamic platforms for arts projects, programmers and producers who wish to create amazing creative experiences for children, young people and adults. Inch Architecture and Design is represented tonight by Alistair Clements, Director, and Jennifer McCare, Creative Director and Teaching Fellow in the University of Strathclyde's Architecture Department. Inch is a social enterprise, architecture, design and research practice. They are driven by their social intent, objectives and desire to deliver projects which have a positive and lasting effect on the community and the users of their buildings. The work displayed tonight is part of their Trauma-Informed Spaces and Places project, a collaboration between the two organisations which aims to promote healing, improve physical and mental health, and the overall well-being of care experienced young people in their community. And we welcome this important contribution to this evening. Lower Kilbrandon's legacy, our unique children's healing system, touches all of the professions and services that interact with Scotland's young people. For this reason, the lecture series considers the vast range of issues that can impact on a child's upbringing and explores how together we can make Scotland the best place to grow up. The lecture is now an important part of the university's annual events calendar. In relation to future events, can I draw your attention to our annual Kilbrandon Children's Research webinar, which is organised by Dr. Graham Connolly, and this year is focused on the very live topic of masculinities. This is taking place on the 4th of December at 5 p.m. The University of Strathclyde was founded by Professor John Anderson during the Enlightenment to be a place of useful learning. The instructions in his will ask that this institution all be a place open to everyone, regardless of gender, status or income. Values that you will recognise as being in keeping with the ethos of the Kilbrandon report. This institution continues its commitment to being a place for useful learning. Strathclyde's Department of Social Work and Social Policy and the university more broadly undertakes high quality research and knowledge exchange across a number of key research themes, including research on children, young people and families. Before I pass back to Fiona, can I note that what is shared and discussed may be upsetting and can affect us all. So please take time out if you need to during the lecture and afterwards. There'll be information shared on organisations that can provide assistance and support on a slide at the end of the lecture. Thank you and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Neil. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Carlene Firmin. I'm going to call her Carlene because she is my friend. So Carlene is Professor of Social Work and the Director of the Global Centre for Contextual Safeguarding at Durham University. She's also co-editor and chief of the British Journal of Social Work, co-convener of a special interest group on social work and adolescence for the European Social Work Research Association, a Global Ashoka Fellow, a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and a member of the Churchill Fellowship Advisory Group. So she's quite busy. Professor Firmin is also an associate of ours at CYCJ, the most prestigious of all your roles, I'm sure, Carlene. Professor Firmin has researched young people's experience of community and group-based violence since 2008 and has advocated for comprehensive approaches that keep them safe in public places, schools and peer groups. Carlene coined the term contextual safeguarding in 2014 to describe a vision for improving safeguarding responses to young people at risk of harm beyond their family homes. She has overseen a research programme to convert this vision into a conceptual and practice framework in order to reform safeguarding responses and policy frameworks concerned with extra-familiar harm, including child sexual exploitation, child criminal exploitation, and peer abuse in the UK and internationally. She has written in The Guardian since 2010 and is widely published in the area of children's child welfare, having published 4 books and over 50 peer-reviewed papers, book chapters and reports. In her book, Contextual Safeguarding and Child Protection, Rewriting the Rules, won the Real Church Prize for Sociology Monograph in 2020. I now would like you to join me in inviting Carlene Firmin to deliver the 23rd Kilbrandon Lecture. Thank you. I'm going to put my timer on, otherwise I'm going to get carried away. Good evening, everyone. It's a real honour and pleasure to be here with you all today to talk about contextual safeguarding and to focus in particular on the cultural reform that's needed to bring contextual safeguarding to life. Before I start, as has already been said, this presentation actually will predominantly focus on practices that try to build safety for children and young people. But in order to do that, it will also include examples of harm that they face from services as well as from communities and in their interpersonal relationships. And so if you do need to step out at any time, please feel free to do so. I won't take it personally or think that I'm boring you. Just take your time. I also want to say before I start that there are a number of researchers who have informed what I'm about to share and have informed my work over the last 15 years, including people like Jenny Pierce, Janine Davis, Claudia Bernard, Reid Featherstone, Anna Gupta, and academics in my own team, Jenny Lloyd, Rachel Owens, and Lauren Rowe, to mention a few. And when I was putting this speech together, I was really conscious, having watched previous Kilbrandon lectures, that there really weren't many quotes from academics on my slides at all. And I quickly hurried about and thought maybe I should add all these quotes in from researchers that have informed me. And then I took a pause and thought, I'm not going to do that. They absolutely are evident in the approach that I take, but the quotes I use are largely from children and young people, families and practitioners, because they're the people who directly inform my work and help me explain what we're trying to do. So I wanted to get that off my chest first, then I didn't feel concerned the whole way through that I wasn't quoting multiple academics. I also want to thank the University of Strathclyde for having me here today, and particularly Fiona Dyer for inviting me to deliver this lecture. So why is common sense complicated? Well, over the past 15 years, we've been trying to grapple with a very particular situation that we see in multiple child protection systems around the world. And that is a situation in which young people come to harm in extra-familial contexts and relationships. They come to harm in their friendship groups, they come to harm in public spaces, in school environments, from adults unconnected to their caregivers. But the child protection systems that have been increasingly drawn upon to protect them were designed to intervene with those children and their families, particularly those children and their parents, and not the peer group schools or public spaces where that harm was occurring. And that's why when I was reviewing cases during my thesis, I read statements like this from Sarah, who said, if you're rude to them, then they'll beat you up. And I've seen how they beat up people, how everyone's scared of them. I said no for something very little. I've been beaten up and bottled, and I realised if I did say no, what would happen. I was pressurised and scared. I knew deep down I didn't want it because I was still young, but I didn't have a choice. Sarah was very clear about the situation she was in. It was a situation in which she was being exploited by a group of young people from her local community, and that exploitation was happening in her school, it was happening at bus stops, it was happening in fast food restaurants, and she felt unable to gain any sense of safety. But the professionals who responded to Sarah largely assessed her and her parent, the capacity of her parent to keep her safe. And when her parent was assessed as doing all she could, Sarah was closed to children's social work completely, and then would re-enter the system due to offending behaviour later down the line. Then she was taken into care, then she was placed into secure accommodation, all around the issues that she was grappling with outside of the home. She was absolutely experiencing harm in extra-familial context, but it was her and her family who were the subject of the intervention. And so when I was doing this work, there have been gradual calls for a paradigm shift
in what was needed in terms of safeguarding responses to extrafamilial harm in the Hanson and Holmes Difficult Age Report in 2013, and then later as a result of the cases I had reviewed, both identifying the need for fundamental transformation rather than incremental service redesign. And that was what led to the introduction of the contextual safeguarding framework, which I first published in 2016. And the framework recommends 4 things. It suggests that firstly, systems need to be capable of targeting the context where children are harmed. And that's the kind of common sense bit, but I'll go on to explain why that is quite complicated. So if a child is abused in their family, that would be the subject of the assessment and the plan. If a child is abused in their peer group or in a park or in school, that context needs to be the focus of our response. Not just seeing the child in context, but working to change that context that it then becomes safe for that child to be there. The second feature of the framework was its legislative basis, arguing that whether a child was abused within the family home or in an extrafamilial context, they should always receive a child welfare and child protection response. Whereas at the time in England, what we had was if you were abused within your family home, you received a child protection response. If you were abused outside of the family home, the system that was leveraged to coordinate a response to that risk was largely the criminal justice system, not just to you as a child, but coordinated the disruption and dispersal of those who were harming you, kind of sat with them in community safety partnerships. The third part of the framework were the partnerships brought it to life. So contextual safeguarding is only feasible if it's delivered in partnership with young people, with parents and carers, wider communities, and those that have an influence over the places and spaces where harm occurs, like those that run hospitality, retail, parks and recreation, youth workers, those that run schools, are all key partners in the delivery of a contextual safeguarding system. And finally, the system needs to measure its impact contextually. So we wouldn't want to know if Sarah was safer as a result of our intervention alone. We'd want to know if the park where she was being assaulted was any safer, or had Sarah been taken out of that situation and other children had taken her place because the harm remained there, which is exactly what did happen to Sarah. And indeed, a couple of the girls who witnessed her being assaulted, when she was taken into care and moved away, they were then assaulted by that same group of young people. And it took them a very long time to speak up about that because they didn't want to be taken into care. And they thought that if they did tell, they would have to leave too. So we want to know that the situation has been made safer, not just the individual child that's impacted in that situation. So that in essence is contextual safeguarding. It's any response to extrafamilial harm that targets the context where that harm occurs, utilising child protection and child welfare legislation to centre children's needs, in partnership with those that can influence those contexts and where you measure your impact contextually. And in very many ways, that feels like common sense. And whenever I speak to parents in particular about contextual safeguarding, or just like the friends I made on maternity leave, or the guy that runs the coffee shop when they ask me what I do, they were like, but don't we do that anyway? Surely that's common sense. If you're being harmed in a peer group, you'd respond to the peer group. If you're being harmed in a park, you'd respond to the park. And I said, yeah, it does feel that way, but it's not how our system was designed. Contextual safeguarding requires you to target the context where this harm happens, but we're utilising systems designed to target young people and their families. Contextual safeguarding requires us to utilise child protection and child welfare legislation to coordinate those responses, when actually responses to public spaces are often underpinned by crime and disorder and wider community safety legislation. It requires us to work with people and organisations who are in the places and spaces where this harm occurs. Our system is designed to work with a key number of statutory partners like social workers, police, health professionals and educationalists. And contextual safeguarding requires that we measure change in context and that we also measure individual change contextually. To explain that, one young person who featured in a case I reviewed, was truanting from school, and it was the only behaviour he displayed that suggested something was going wrong for him. And the school had used sanctions to try to keep him in school, and those sanctions had been ineffective. So children's services were contacted, and it turned out he had a sibling with a disability, and it was believed that maybe things had got a bit chaotic at home, and if more support was put into the family home, everyone would get out of home on time in the mornings and get to school on time, and this young man would be able to concentrate when he was in school. The family said they didn't think that was an issue, but that was the plan that was put in place, and his behaviour didn't change. The school then threatened to fine his parents for not getting him into education, and within a couple of weeks he was in school on time every day and stayed in lessons when he was there. So if we're thinking about measuring impact individually, the most effective intervention was the threat to fine his parents, because before that he was truanting from school, and when that threat was made, he started to attend school, and the goal was a reduction in truancy or increased attendance at school. I was later asked to review his case because when he started to attend school, he was sexually and physically assaulted by a group of young people who were at his school, although the assault happened in the community after school. And it then turned out he'd been coming in late every day because he waited for everybody to be in classrooms before he had come into the school building. And then he waited for teachers to be in those classrooms before he'd go into them. And then if he needed to use the toilets, he'd use them during the lesson time, because if he used the toilets in the break time, he was assaulted in the toilets. So the moment his truancy went down, his risk actually went up. A reduction in truancy, a reduction in going missing from home, even a reduction in offending is not necessarily an indicator of safety. It's often an indicator of compliance. And that young man complied because he knew his parents couldn't afford a fine, not because he was safe to go to school. So even when we're measuring individual change for children, we have to understand that individual change contextually. But at the moment, our system is really designed to measure individual change in isolation of everything else. And services are often commissioned on the basis that they will reduce offending by this much, they will increase education by this much, they will reduce missing behaviours by this much, not that they will create the conditions in which that type of behaviour change is possible and safe. So while contextual safeguarding feels like common sense, it's actually counter the way our systems have been designed to operate. And what we see is in organisations that start to implement the framework, they become stuck in a number of places because they rub up against that mismatch between the intention of the systems and how they were designed and what contextual safeguarding is seeking to achieve. Now, over the years, particularly the last 10 years, we've worked with a number of local authorities, including local authorities in Scotland, to assist in structural redesigns that would make contextual safeguarding more feasible. These have included contextualising the individual work that already happens with children and young people, introducing safety mapping activities that social workers and youth workers and others complete to identify where are young people feeling safe or unsafe in their local community, where are their red zones, where are their green zones, and where are their amber zones that might be safe at 3 p.m. but not at 10 p.m. And using that kind of safety mapping to develop a plan of support for that child, making sure we're not requiring them to attend an intervention that's based in a red zone, for example. And we've seen the use of things like context weighting, where multi-agency professionals in groups will weight the influence of different contexts on young people's safety and ask themselves, if we've identified that, as in this image, the school is the most unsafe context for this young person, followed by their peer group, is the plan that we've put in place for them targeting the school or the peer group? Or does our assessment tell us that these are the contexts that are unsafe for the young person, but the plan is a parenting course for mum because that's what's available in our service, and we've got a mismatch between what's being offered and what's needed? And we've also seen the introduction of safeguarding pathways for context themselves, and many local authorities can now accept a referral for a school environment or a park where children and young people are unsafe, and social workers and youth workers will go into those contexts and assess them in order to identify what support is needed. And we've developed policy and procedural reforms to facilitate that type of structural change. And contextual safeguarding went into the Scottish Child Protection Guidelines in 2021, naming things like context weighting and the need to respond to contexts where harm was occurring to authorise that direction of practice. And that structural change has been good, and we continue to support it in local authorities across the UK and increasingly internationally. But in the wrong cultural context, those types of structural reforms have led to all sorts of practices that we would not say are culturally aligned to contextual safeguarding. These have included things like using dispersal orders to move children out of public spaces where they are unsafe, increased monitoring of those children, particularly through the use of additional policing of those children or CCTV to monitor where they are, mapping their friends and then disrupting their friends, using bail conditions to stop young people from spending time with each other, excluding children from schools, using managed moves to move them out of unsafe school environments, designing public spaces so that young people don't want to spend time in them, playing music, because apparently young people don't listen to classical music. I mean, I used to, but apparently some young people don't. We saw one move to kind of take a roof off a bus stop that young people were congregating under so they get wet when it rains and then they'd move on. Switching off the internet in public spaces to leave them with unmet needs. They need the internet, they can't access it here, so they won't spend time here. See that a lot in fast food restaurants. And extensive information about their lives and all manner of their lives, like, you know, what they ate on Friday, without their consent or even their knowledge. None of these things are actually aligned to contextual safeguarding at all. What they represent are often interventions with individuals in contexts. They are not interventions with contexts, and they do not produce safeguarding outcomes. And for both of those reasons, they often don't align to contextual safeguarding. To just explain one of them, the internet scenario, we saw a number of fast food restaurants switch off their internet to stop young people congregating in them because those young people were being approached and groomed into criminal exploitation. As a result of turning off the internet, adults offered their flats up to those young people to come and use the internet. And then they were exploited by those adults in return for the internet. So leaving children without their needs being met does not create safety. And in those incidents, it looked like it had, because there have been lots of complaints about antisocial behaviour. We switched off the internet. Now there's no complaints about antisocial behaviour. And meanwhile, those children were being given internet by unsafe adults in private homes and were now out of the line of sight of any professionals who were concerned for their welfare. So simply responding to individuals in extrafamilial contexts is not contextual safeguarding. And these types of practices have forced us to much better articulate the cultural change that is needed to adopt this type of approach, and not just the structural change. So back in 2019, we would often go into local organisations and we would ask them very structurally focused questions. We would say things like, what's your pathway for referring and assessing friendship groups? What structures do you use to organise the services you provide for adolescents? What recording systems are you using to measure your impact on context? Very structural, procedural interventions into systems and organisations. 3 years on from that, when we'd kind of tried to do whole system implementation in multiple areas, and we're seeing varying levels of success, some really successful adoption and some really questionable adoption using the same structural changes, we started to change those questions and instead ask, not what is your process for assessing peers, but how do you involve young people in conversations about their friends and in your work to assess peer relationships? How do your workforce even view adolescence? Is probably a pretty fundamental question, because a number of people don't actually like young people. And that is a real challenge when you're trying to implement a contextual safeguarding approach, but it's rarely named. And that frustration, you know, we hear professionals say, well, don't give me a teenager, I don't want a teenager, just give me the babies. They don't like them. So we need to kind of understand that in terms of a cultural fit to do this type of work. And how are you measuring your impact on context? Are you looking for safety, or are you just looking for risk? Are you speaking to young people, or are you looking at crime data? Because crime and antisocial behaviour data is often data about adults reporting young people for being antisocial. It's not data about young people's experiences of crime, because often they don't report those experiences of crime. So if we want to know where children and young people are unsafe, we can't always rely on public data. We have to go directly to children and young people to ask them. So to understand cultures, we've definitely seen the need to move away from what are you doing and move towards how are you doing that. And when we see that move from what to how, we start to notice certain things that are really integral to cultural fit with contextual safeguarding. The first is developing approaches that really are able to meet children's needs and not solely focus on reducing risk. And this is really difficult in the space of extrafamilial harm because there is a lot of pressure on services to reduce the risks that children face. And I understand that completely. But when that is not balanced appropriately with consideration of need, or when need is not foregrounded, often needs are left unmet. When we look at what children and young people actually need when they're impacted by extrafamilial harm, we see things like they need time and space with people who care about them. They need safe access to education. They need housing. They need internet. They need food. They need to be able to take safe risks because they're teenagers, and that's what teenagers often like to do. And they need some privacy. These things are developmentally normal behaviours. And they also need a sense of psychological safety and well-being in terms of their mental health and emotional stability. What we often see commissioned for these children are 12-week knife crime awareness programme, 6-month healthy relationships programme, 1-year mentoring service that may, to varying degrees, address risk, help them understand risk, see risk, reduce unsafe, risky behaviours, but don't give many time with their friends, don't ensure they have a safe place to live, don't ensure they have food to eat, don't give them internet access. Often we restrict these things, we restrict their phones, we restrict their privacy, we restrict their time with their friends. We don't want to take any risks at all. And that creates a child who has multiple unmet needs because the fixation on risk reduction has overwhelmed the response. When the culture is aligned, organisations can hold both things. And you see that in that quote on this slide from a social worker who's writing to a young person and said, "You have witnessed a significant assault on your best friend, whereby he was stabbed last year. There's been ongoing concern for your safety since this time, both in school and outside of school, in the community. It is clear that everybody around you is finding it increasingly difficult to keep you safe from the risks of serious youth violence. You were really open with me about how this has impacted on your mental health and how you were struggling to remain on track and not retaliate." When young people see needs being recognised, and they see risk being held in a system rather than creating anxiety, they will open up about what they need. And what this young man needed was help with his mental health. And he needed the space to be able to say that before everyone panicked and secured him, for example. He needed to be able to be open and for the system to be able to hold that with him. And that young man was able to access mental health support and remain at home with his family. When the cultural fit is right, we also see a move towards building our collective capacity to protect young people. We're not just thinking about a parent's capacity, of course that remains important, but we're also thinking about what we as a collective, all of us in this room and others around children and young people, provide for them in terms of their safety, because we all have different ways of influencing that, different ways of meeting their needs, different ways of influencing the context where they're spending their time. So instead of focusing on what a parent's capacity is to protect a child, we first have to ask whose capacity or even capability to utilise the work of Sen and Gupta, whose capacity is actually being undermined when a child is sexually abused by peers at school? Who is unable to protect them? And what is undermining their capability to do that? What is getting in the way? Because then when we respond, we try to build the capability of those that run the school or run the high street or run the fast food restaurant or utilise the park. We build their capability to be protective. rather than solely fixating on what an individual child or their parent can do to create safety in contexts that are way beyond their control. And parents experience this shift in culture, as we see from this quote from a parent who was supported via a risk outside of the home child protection pathway in England, where she said, "I was really worried. I thought, oh no, like we've got a social worker. That's not what I wanted. What have I done wrong?" But then as I was introduced to all of this, it sort of came to my attention that actually people really trust me as a parent, and they're just looking at what's going on for my boys outside and how they can help. And again, that then facilitated that parent to come alongside professionals and work with them in partnerships to build safety for her children. And finally, when we see that cultural shift, we see a move towards really focusing on how we create safe contexts and not solely focusing on how we create safe individuals. And moving beyond the idea that creating safe contexts is about dispersal, disruption, invasion of privacy and restriction, and safe contexts are about meeting young people's needs, building the capacity of the adults in those spaces to be protective, building their guardianship capacity, and addressing environmental factors that get in the way. Very similar to what we do in terms of a child and family assessment. We would normally assess what children need, assess the capacity of their families to meet those needs, and address environmental factors that undermine the family. And you would recognise this, again, very similar to getting it right for every child in terms of the Scottish framework, but we're applying it to a context and not just to an individual person. And when we do that, we see that shift. And we see that in this quote from this social worker who said, "Everyone was having strategy meetings about how do we disperse this group. And the assessment helped us understand what that friendship group meant to each other. They all have shared lived experiences. They were all children in care. These are friends. These are people who see each other as family. Their core need is to be loved, to be needed, to be wanted, to belong." Peer mapping before that had very much let's share intelligence. And this was all about risk. But we started changing the conversation to what strengths does this group bring to other young people. And it shifted then the plan, a collaborative plan with young people rather than without them. When we work in this way, we are foregrounding an ethic of care in our practice rather than an ethic of justice. And Gilligan's work on a care ethic has been transformational to me, and she is someone who I would put a quote into my slides for. When she says, "I gather up what I have come to know. The different voice, a voice of care ethics, is a human voice. The betrayal of relationship is a betrayal of what's right. The ethic of care is an ethic of resistance to moral injury." And I really like what she's saying here to us. Because the reason why contextual safeguarding often feels like common sense is because it brings a human voice into a system that often dehumanizes children and young people, that has too often described them by a risk rating or a colour or a high, medium, low, or a number on a cohort sheet or a nominal, any terminology we can use apart from child. Particularly for those children who impact extrafamilial harm, even in systems that do better for children who fit more neatly in, when it comes to this group of children, children who are being abused and maybe gaining in their experiences of abuse, we struggle with them. We struggle to humanize them. And what ethic of care does is bring that humanization back. And what people often say to me about contextual safeguarding, which is why I've got the glasses here, is once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it. You think, oh gosh, yeah, I wouldn't have noticed that, but now I'm noticing that. And now that I'm noticing that, I can't tolerate what we are doing. And that's why this conversation around moral injury is so important, because often we create systems that require practitioners to do things that they know is not right for that child, family or community, but is right in accordance with the policy framework to which they are being measured or inspected. And that creates moral injury for a workforce and for the communities that it serves. And so the idea central to a care ethic around need to think about things in context, in relationship, and the interdependence that we all have on each other and the context in which we spend our time really do need to be front and center in the grounding and the cultural development of our practice. So what we see then when we think about contextual safeguarding is a culture that is practiced in a way that is humanizing of children and families, is heartfelt, and is humble. Humanizing I've already talked to, and we really have seen this, and I've learned a lot about this actually from observing practice in Scotland and observing professionals like Nicole Savage, who I know is in the room, chairing meetings in a humanizing way. 5 years ago, if I observed a panel, and I've observed hundreds of panels, I'm probably over 1,000, because that is a structure everyone loves when it comes to extrafamilial harm. We'll get a panel together and that will help us all feel safe organisationally, and we'll develop a plan around a panel. They have a panel meeting, the child is being introduced, and they say, okay, we're here to talk about Carlene. She's currently scoring a 26 out of a 30, or she's currently a red, or she's currently a high risk. She's been missing this many times in the last 3 months. She's committed this many offences. What are we going to do for her? And no one knows me. No one knows what I'm worried about, what keeps me up at night, the fact I really care about my brothers. I used to have a really good relationship with my mum, but it's falling apart and that scares me. I used to be into art, but I haven't got the headspace for it. No one knows that about me. So the plan is then all about the missing episodes and the offending, not about the art, not about my mum, not about my brothers. I'm not a human anymore. I'm a set of figures, risks, and statistics. So that shift to then going into meetings where I am hearing Carlene introduce, okay, we're here to talk about Carlene, talking about what matters to me, who matters to me, changes the nature of the plans that are then produced, and they are more needs orientated. To do this, we really have to love and care for our children. And I definitely noticed that for some reason, particularly in Scotland. Obviously, it helps that you actually use the word love in some of your policies, like in the promise. But I also do have questions about things like racial inequality and how that may or may not impact alignment to these issues, because we often see distance between professionals and young people when they don't all come from the same place. And often when we interview social workers in Scotland, they're Scottish and they know their communities that they serve, they're close to them. When we interview professionals who are trying to support children who are seeking asylum in the UK, where there are cultural divides and they struggle to get that closeness, the cultural commitment to love and social justice is still there, but it takes more work, and it takes active work to be anti-racist in practice, to really love those that you don't feel as close to. And we see that play out in the media, right? We get really upset when there's a natural disaster in a country that feels closer to us, but we struggle to connect to that disaster in a country that feels further away. And you definitely see that in practice, and it's something to really watch for. The humility point, though, is the point that I think is really important, because it's hard to be humble in this space because everyone's under pressure to know what to do. Got to know what to do. You can't possibly say you don't know what to do, because this is a really dangerous situation, so you have to have a plan. But in reality, sometimes it is really hard to know what to do. And that quote I had up before, where the social worker said, everyone is finding it increasingly difficult. Being humble, acknowledging we are finding this difficult, rather entering a situation with certainty that is not real. It doesn't reflect the reality of the situation for the child, for the family, for their community, or for the professional network. And it requires you, in that humility, to recognise where things have gone wrong, where services have made things worse, rather than assuming the only harm children encounter is interpersonal. Some of the harm they encounter comes from services, comes from systems, historically and presently. And humility needs to be there to hold that tension if we're going to provide authentic support to children and families. And this quote from the social work manager, I think, really sums that up when we were kind of pushing them to think about alternative plans for some children. And they said, the difficulties in really trying to change people's thinking about how you intervene with the context. And when I say change thinking, we put ourselves in that group as well, because it's really pushed our way of thinking. It's pushed us massively outside of our comfort zone, because I think your child protection staff, you kind of have a really clear pathway, don't you? You don't deviate from that because it protects the children, we think. It protects you as a worker. So it's really trying to come out of that comfort zone and think a little bit differently. And it's left us feeling quite vulnerable at times. Good. Yeah. You should feel vulnerable in those situations, because how can you be certain in situations that are so uncertain, that change so dynamically, that present so much pressure on children and families? That demonstrates a healthy engagement with the complexity of what's being worked with. And a certain engagement, just for me, suggests that something's being oversimplified in terms of what children and young people need. So I couldn't close this without reflecting on Kilbrandon, and it was a real pleasure to go back to the Kilbrandon report, and it's a real honour to have Kilbrandon's family representatives here in the room today, because so much of what contextual safeguarding calls for is aligned to the principles that were first introduced through the Kilbrandon report. So what we see through contextual safeguarding is an embedding of those principles, but in some ways we also see an extension of them. And there are three ways in which I'd like to reflect that. The first is, yes, in Kilbrandon, we move children from a justice lens towards a care lens, those that are in conflict with the law and those that are in need of support. That is much further than we've seen in many other countries. But what we've come to learn over the 10 years of implementing contextual safeguarding is that taking children and putting them in a welfare-orientated system doesn't magically create needs-focused practice, because those welfare-orientated systems are dominated by risk, risk management, risk dispersal, risk disruption. And I naively thought that you just switch into child protection space and all will be well. But actually, yes, we weren't seeing criminalisation, but we were seeing control in a different way. And that was because risk was foregrounding what was going on and overshadowing need. So even when things on paper said need and risk, in reality, it was risk and need, risk and need. For contextual safeguarding to really come to the fore, risk needs to be in the background, still there, but pushed back a bit. And context needs to come front and centre, because that is also where we need an extension of the Kilbrandon principles. A lot of the focus in children's hearing systems, for example, is on the individual child's needs and the extent to which their parents understand what's required and the child understands, not a response to the context in which that child is coming to harm. So to further extend those principles for children impacted by extrafamilial harm, we need an intentional engagement with how risk-orientated are we being, and also an intentional engagement to foreground context. And therefore, we also need to recognise the child in their family and recognise them in their friendship groups and wider communities. We cannot protect children from extrafamilial harm by intervening with them and their families in isolation of the other contexts where they spend their time. We will only reach a certain number, and we will create victim vacuums that other children fill. We need to, of course, respond to individual need, but we need to have the capacity to move beyond children in a family context and consider them in every context in which they're spending their time. And the other thing we need to be able to move beyond is black and white. There's no better example, I don't think, than children impacted by extrafamilial harm that demonstrate why our binaries are unhelpful. Our binary of victim and perpetrator, protector and harmer. They do not work for children impacted by extrafamilial harm. It's not even about recognising an overlap in victims and perpetrators. That's not enough either. They bleed into one another. You can't understand the victimisation without understanding the offending, and you can't understand the offending without understanding the victimisation. They are one and the other. It's not about understanding them both. It's understanding how they impact each other. And for children who are being exploited into drug distribution, for example, or children who are being sexually exploited, these children, many of them will see a bleeding of those identities and be then supported in systems that still try to pull those identities apart. Kilbrandon provides space for us to recognise that intersection by creating a process for children who are both in need of care and support and children who are in conflict with the law. And we need to think far more about how we work in that way. So ultimately, I think that going back to the Kilbrandon principles enables us to think about how far we've come, to develop responses to extrafamilial harm that are built on care rather than built on risk or built on justice. I would say for the most part, in most countries I've visited, we still have a justice-orientated response to these children and young people that we've tried to make a bit kinder. So we will still do all these things to you. We'll still try to control you, restrict you, but we'll just be kinder in how we talk about you or how we engage with you. What we need to be doing is moving towards a care-orientated system in which justice plays its part. So it slots into a caring system rather than overwhelms it. And I think this quote from this parent really exemplifies that for me. And I often get a bit tearful when I read this quote, because this is a mother who experienced a child protection response to extrafamilial harm and then experienced a contextual safeguarding one. And she said, they were saying, we want to make this work so you can have the best life. We're not here to take you away, not telling us how stupid she is or what horrible mistakes she's making, and it's all her fault and she should know better. We haven't had any of that this time. It's been very understanding, very calm. And there's loads in that quote. You could do a whole lecture just on it. But the thing that stands out to me the most is that it's been very understanding, very calm. It hasn't been panicked, risk-driven, overwhelming, chuck every resource we could possibly have, all the interventions that they haven't asked for, so that if something goes wrong, we can demonstrate we do something. We're going to take her away from the family who loves her. We're going to secure her because we're panicking. And also, we don't just want the bare minimum for you. We don't just want you to survive. We want you to have the best life. We want you to thrive. We're going to offer you things that go beyond understanding what a healthy relationship is. The amount of young women I've interviewed in prison, they can all tell me exactly what a healthy relationship is. Not one of them had access to one. The context they were in were unsafe. You can't teach them into finding a healthy relationship. Sure, they could then recognize they were in a really difficult situation, but it didn't change that situation for them. So having those broader ambitions for a full life is so important. And so that's really why common sense is so complicated. We have to like young people, and we often operate in systems that don't. We have to challenge a preoccupation with risk, and that's really difficult when we're under pressure to demonstrate action. We have to look beyond interpersonal harms to recognise system harm and structural harm and contextual harm in systems that literally isolate harm to being things that happen just between individual people or groups of people. So we have to be willing to give up our binaries. We have to be willing to work without the safety that they often provide. We put the victims over here and the perpetrators over here, the protective responses here and the harmful people over here. You have to be willing to move beyond them, even though that feels destabilizing, and actually respond to what people need. And you have to believe that all of that is actually possible. You have to be hopeful in a pretty cynical world. So I'm not really surprised that contextual safeguarding is complicated and the common sense of it all feels hard. But I do want to know if you're ready to join me. Thank you.
Carlene, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking lecture. Every time I hear you, I think I pick something else out of it, and I'm sitting reflecting just on my own practice as a social worker years ago, and even now in CYCJ, and what we can do and how we describe children and young people and that difference. And yeah, definitely, I've got a lot of thoughts, but we're not here to talk about me. So I do have two individuals who are going to give you a formal response. I'd like to come and join Carlene, and that is Ryan McShane and Alison Gordon. If you could come and join us on the stage, please. So first, we're going to hear from Ryan, I believe. So Ryan is, as Neil had mentioned earlier, is a care experience campaigner and a law student here at Strathclyde University. For over a decade, Ryan has been an active member of Who Cares Scotland. Ryan was elected to Scotland's Youth Parliament to represent Who Cares Scotland's care experience membership. Other work Ryan has been involved in includes the incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law, and is currently a member of the Promise Oversight Board. So Ryan, over to you.
Thanks, Fiona. I often reflect on journeys. I think about how people change and how society changes. And change is a difficult word. I think we all struggle with it. Throughout the lecture that you've just heard, I was sat there and I think I changed my mind about 20 times. Each slide and each sentence probably that Carlene's just delivered. But I think about change and why it's difficult. I grew up early 2002. That makes me 23 years old, which is scary to think about. But I was already destined to be in the care system before I was born, because there was older siblings who were already in care and had been in and out of different care settings. So my life chances were already determined before I was born. But how did that change? How was it meant to change? It was meant to change because this wee guy, Ryan, at the time thought, I'm going to do something about that. And what happened was there was definitely audiences like you've just seen in parks, within playgrounds, within school classrooms, where for me to avoid the chaos that was happening in the family home, I had to create that chaos in the classroom and in the playground just to survive. Now, I knew that there was definitely people like teachers, like dinner ladies, like janitors, who had my best interests at heart, but they didn't always know the context of why they needed the best interest to be there. It was part of their DNA. They did it. And the glasses picture that it was mentioned, it was up there. It's not until you see something and it makes you think, it makes you go, I can't now unseen that, like you were mentioning. But what I was seeing was poverty. Poverty was not just happening to me, but it was happening to 90% of my class. But that poverty was happening in an area of Glasgow, which is almost a stone's throw away from here, that had already been chosen to be regenerated. They called it the New Gorbals. And if you know the Gorbals now, it's a completely different place. But that chapter of my life only ended, now I left there almost 15 years ago. That chapter of my life psychologically ended at the end of June. I grew up 15 in a high-rise block, no garden. One saying that the garden was for me about 5 miles north, south, east, and west, take from that way well. But for me, your own community was people that were just running about you, you know. But even it was quite difficult to have just a conversation with those people, but they were part of your community. You just had to go with it. So there was a few quotes there that I seen with Ryan. You know, I also seen Ryan's mum, Ryan's dad, who tried and who too often would say that's their fault for that's happening. It wasn't, people weren't thinking about society and what was happening around about them. I actually just today went through Glasgow Central, bumped into one of wee Ryan's old pals, James. James looked at me and went, is that the same guy? My values have always been love. I knew I was loved by all those that were around about me, but I couldn't show that affection back. But the context of that was poverty. The Gorbals now, if I could go back and say to, you know, I think it was City Building, I think they're still kicking about in Glasgow, take the young people with you on that journey. Tell them the context of why that area is changing. Don't just, I use an analogy like Sims, you know, the game. You pick the person up, you move them. That's almost like we were just planted, there you go, and it was a short-term fix, but ended up long-term. So for me, it all goes back to poverty. And if we can, I think there's a quote that we all know about, you know, if, you know, we judge our society by how we treat the children, absolutely. But it's actually about how we are going to treat our children. And we have big ambitions in Scotland. I like to big us up as much as possible whenever I do international work. I spoke at the UN in 2018. It would have been on the discussion on care and whatnot. And I remember thinking to myself, if I look back in 20, 30, 40 years' time and know that we had a real opportunity to do something, and I know I was part of that somehow with my own lived experience, and we never done something about it, I would be really angry. Carlene spoke about being humble, being heartfelt. In 2016, when the Independent Care Review was announced, I was front row at that party conference. But I didn't see the First Minister lead that day, although she did. I seen a human, and that was the other H word within that humanising. I was 20 yards away from her, but 6 weeks before that, she took on board what people were saying. She already started that in the Thousand Voices campaign, and I looked at it from a very personal point of view and a distance, and went, this matters to this government, this matters to people like social workers, like education workers, like people like Alison. So we need to kick on, and we need to do what we should have done 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and let's get on. And like Carlene said, will you join me?
Brian, thank you so much for that. I'd now like to introduce Alison Gordon from North Lanarkshire Council. Alison is the past convener of Social Work Scotland. She has been in North Lanarkshire Council's Chief Social Work Officer for the past 10 years, and Alison is the lead officer of North Lanarkshire's Children's Service Partnership, whose focus includes integrated approach to whole family support, poverty and prevention. So agenda she is very passionate about. And Alison sees where contextual safeguarding is central to all her work. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. I can't bring the authority to this conversation that Ryan just has, but I can talk a little bit, I think, about our contextual safeguarding journey and our attempts to get it right, or at least more right, for our young people. I've heard Carlene speak a few times, and I always find it a mixture of fascinating, challenging, scary, provocative, and motivating. And I come from this with the benefit of working with a team who's passionate about this. One of my health colleagues reminded me in the foyer earlier that we first started talking about this when I think Carlene first came to Scotland in 2019. And every time I hear her, I think we're further back on the journey than I thought we were. But we have made huge progress. I think, it's important to keep the eye on the prize here in relation to that. There's a lot of debate at the moment in Scotland about extrafamilial harm, and particular child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs. And whatever the decision is about how we approach that, inquiry or no inquiry, I think it's really important that we don't forget the other bits that we need to look at and continue to move forward with that wider context for our children and young people. On the structure piece, I think we have got a really facilitating environment in many ways. I agree about the fundamentals of Kilbrandon. We've got the Reimagining Secure Care programme, we've got the Promise, we've got lots of other things. But at the same time, there's so much we still need to resolve. And I was very thoughtful about what you said, Carlene, about some of our missteps in trying to sort things in terms of context. And if I hear someone else say, take the bus passes of these young people and they go into Glasgow from North Lanarkshire and get into all sorts of trouble, then, it happens all the time. And I think there's a temptation to go down that sort of journey. We've been very good. I'm thinking about the sort of peer friendships, the importance of peers to our young people. We've been very good, I think, within our systems of beginning to think of siblings and family in a wider context and networks. We always, when I'm speaking to my team sometimes about young people where we may be considering secure care and we talk about maintaining friendships, that seems to be far lower down the list. And actually, the way that we work with people in that context doesn't facilitate that in the way that we would want to do, however important it might be to some of our young people. I think there's a real need for us to invest in young people for the longer term. And that's, you know, both in terms of early intervention. We work really closely with our youth work colleagues who sometimes do much better work in this space than we do, despite my pride in being a social worker. And I think I'm really thoughtful about what Carlene said about information sharing and data, because again, there's a lot of focus on that just now and getting that right. But to what extent we ask the permission, or at least explain to young people why we're sharing information about them and give them some efficacy and control over the process, is something that I think we're quite far away from, and getting that right. And we talk a lot about voice, but we sometimes don't give voice in the way that it really needs to be to individualise and understand the young people that we're working with well, and their families and perspectives. I think the whole conversation about safety rather than risk is really important, but I'm really conscious of how scary that can be for our networks, for our staff, and how much support people need to begin to have that conversation and to begin to look at things in those terms. It is a difficult space, but if we don't understand that young people's perceptions of safety can be very different from ours, and what supports them to be safe is something that might be very different from what we think, then we're not going to get it right. I'm glad to hear about the focus on needs as well. And I think that bit about longer term needs and thinking of young people's futures beyond the immediate challenges they face is really important, recognising their individuality and making sure that that's reflected in the plans for them. And back to the workforce and staff, really, because I think for all of us, we need to give people permission to innovate. We've tried to do that locally, and learn from those on the front line who are supporting our young people. But it's hard, and you also need to give people support, containment, care, and love as well from us, and talk to, you know, understand why people get nervy when we're trying to do this complex work, as Carlene said. But I am still hopeful, like Ryan. I'm optimistic, and I hope just Carlene coming back and sharing her reflections, and I suppose a bit of a call to arms on this again today, really will help us take this forward in Scotland.